In this video lesson, we'll review the second half of Chapter 34, FDR and the Shadow of War. The phony war was the period following the collapse of Poland, when a silence fell over Europe, and Hitler shifted divisions from Poland for the knockout blow at France. The Soviets were prepared to attack Finland, and Finland had been granted $30 million by the Isolationist Congress for non-military supplies, but they were flattened by the Soviet steamroller. This was an abrupt end to the phony war in April 1940 when Hitler overran Denmark and Norway. Hitler then took the Netherlands and Belgium, followed by a paralyzing blow at France. By late June, France was forced to surrender. This crisis brought forth the inspired leader in the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who nerved his people to fight off the fearful air bombings of their cities. France's sudden collapse shocked the Americans right out of their daydreams, and the possible death of Britain, a constitutional government, steeled the American people to a tremendous effort. This picture is Hitler swaggering into Paris in 1940. Roosevelt's moves had called upon already a debt-burdened nation to build huge air fleets and a two-ocean navy which could check Japan. Congress appropriated $37 billion, a figure more than the total cost of World War I and about 5 times larger than any New Deal annual budget. This was you can pause and look at this. This was actually an opinion poll about the United States going to war during this time period. I think it's 1939. Congress passed the conscription law, or the draft, on September 6, 1940. This was America's first peacetime draft, because Americans were still not involved in the war, but it provided for training for each year 1.2 million troops and 800,000 reserves, and the act was later adapted to the requirements of a global war. At the Havana Conference of 1940, the United States agreed to share with 20 New World neighbors the responsibility of upholding the Monroe Doctrine. Now multilateral, it would be wielded by 21 pairs of hands, at least in theory. There were refugees from the Holocaust as well, and Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were affected. They were frequent victims of mob attacks approved or condoned by local authorities. By November 9, 1938, they were instigated by a speech from the Nazi Joseph Goebbels. Mobs ransacked more than 7,000 Jewish shops and almost all synagogues in Germany. 91 Jews were killed, and about 30,000 were sent to concentration camps in the wake of the Kristallnacht, which is the Night of Broken Glass. The St. Louis left Germany in 1939 with 937 passengers, almost all Jewish refugees, and went to Cuba, and then to Miami, and then to Canada. But they had to return to Europe, where many were killed by the Nazis, because none of these places would allow them shelter. This is a picture of shattered Jewish storefronts in Berlin after the Kristallnacht on November 9, 1938. The War Refugee Board was created by Roosevelt in 1942, and it did save thousands of Hungarian Jews from deportation to the death camp at Auschwitz. But only 150,000 Jews, mostly Germans and Austrians, found refuge in the United States. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. This is a picture of Albert Einstein being sworn in as a U.S. citizen in 1940. He first arrived in 1933 on U.S. soil, but he was one of a very few Jewish refugees that were admitted by the United States during the Holocaust. Bolstering Britain. So Britain in war in August 1940, the Hitler launched air attacks on Great Britain to prepare for the September invasion. The Battle of Britain raged for months in the air, and the Royal Air Force's tenacious defense eventually led Hitler to postpone the planned invasion indefinitely. The debate intensified in the United States over what foreign policy should be embraced. The radio built sympathy for the British, but not enough to push the U.S. into war. Roosevelt faced a historic decision. He could hunker down in the Western Hemisphere and assume Fortress America as a defensive posture and let the rest of the world go it alone, or he could bolster the beleaguered British by all means short of war itself. Both positions had advocates in the United States. The supporters of aid to Britain formed propaganda groups. The most potent one was the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. This is pro-British propaganda, a patriotic poster that was put out by the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. The argument was double-barreled. To interventionists, it appealed for direct succor to British by such slogans as "British is fighting our fight" or "Britain is fighting our fight." To isolationists, it appealed for assistance to democracies by all methods short of war, so the conflict would be kept to faraway Europe. Isolationists, both numerous and sincere, were very vocal. They organized the America First Committee, and they contended that Americans should concentrate their strength to defend their own shores, their basic philosophy being the Yanks are not coming. And most effective speechmaker of this group was Charles A. Lindbergh, who was the famous pilot. In Britain, they were in critical need of destroyers because of the German subs. So on September 2nd, 1940, Roosevelt agreed to transfer Great Britain 50 World War I destroyers. In return, the British handed over to the United States 8 valuable base sites stretching from Netherlands to South America. They were to remain under the Stars and Stripes for 99 years. This is actually called the Destroyers for Bases deal. This agreement legally was questionable since it was a presidential agreement not passed by Congress. It was an unneutral act, but public opinion polls demonstrated that the majority supported all aid short of war to England. This was at the time period, during this time, a distracting presidential election took place, with the Republicans running Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, lawyer Thomas E. Dewey of New York, and latecomer Wendell Willkie of Indiana. So at the Philadelphia Convention, Willkie is chosen as the Republican candidate. The platform condemned FDR's alleged dictatorship and costly and confusing zigzags of the New Deal. Now, the Democrats in Chicago decided a third-termer was better than a third-rater, and Willkie agreed with FDR on the necessity to bolster the beleaguered democracies. So in foreign policy, both of them had promised to stay out of the war. Both had promised to strengthen the nation's defenses, and Willkie hit hard at Rooseveltian dictatorships, as of the idea of Roosevelt's dictatorship and his third term. Roosevelt, busy in the White House, made very few speeches. He promised no men would be sent into foreign wars, but this later came back to plague him. He and the supporters defended the New Deal and all-out preparations for defense of America and aid to the Allies. So in the count, Roosevelt triumphed, although Willkie ran a strong race. The popular total was fairly close, but the electoral count was 449 to 82. This contest was less a walkaway than in 1932 and 1936. The Democratic majorities in Congress remained about the same, and the Democrats hailed this as a triumph, as a mandate to abolish the two-term tradition. Voters felt that should the war come, an experienced leader was needed at the helm. This map, or figure, shows the presidential election of 1940 with the electoral votes by Senate. A landmark Lend-Lease law is passed at this time, so lending and leasing policy was a scheme of Roosevelt to provide the arms to the democracies running out of money. So the Lend-Lease bill was passed, patriotically, numbered 1776, and entitled An Act Further to Promote the Defense of the United States. This was praised by the administration as a device that would keep the nation out of war rather than drag it in. The underlying concept was send guns, not sons, or billions, not bodies. America, Roosevelt promised, would be the arsenal of democracy. They would send limitless supplies of arms to the victims of aggression, who in return would finish the job and keep the war on their side of the Atlantic. The accounts were settled by the returning used weapons or equivalents to the United States when the war ended. This was debated in Congress, with opposition coming from isolationists and anti-Rooseveltian Republicans. The scheme was assailed as a blank check bill, but nevertheless the bill was approved in March 1941 by sweeping majorities in both houses of Congress. No to Lend-Lease, as members of the Mothers' Crusade against the Lend-Lease bill knelt in prayer near the Capitol in a plea to Congress to kill the measure. The Lend-Lease was one of the most momentous laws ever to pass Congress. The challenge was hurled directly at the Axis dictators. America pledged to bolster nations indirectly defending the USA by fighting aggression. So by 1945, Americans had sent about $50 billion worth of arms and equipment to nations fighting the aggressors. The passing of the Lend-Lease was actually an economic declaration of war. A shooting declaration could not be very far around the corner. This map shows the main flow of the Lend-Lease aid from the United States to the nations that were fighting the aggressors. They abandoned any pretense of neutrality at this point, and no destroyer deal was arranged privately by Roosevelt. The bill was universally debated, and most Americans were prepared to take the chance, though, rather than see Britain collapse and then face the dictators alone. So the results of the Lend-Lease Act geared the U.S. factories for an all-out war production and enormously increased the capacity that saved America when the shooting war started. Hitler recognized the Lend-Lease Act as an unofficial declaration of war, and until then, Germany had avoided attacking U.S. ships. But after Lend-Lease, there was little point in trying to curry favor with the U.S. So on May 21, 1941, the Robin Moore, an unarmed merchantman owned by American, was torpedoed and destroyed by a German submarine. Two global events marked the course of World War II. The fall of France in June of 1940, and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Stalin had balked at German control of the Balkans. Hitler decided to crush his co-conspirator, seize his oil, and other resources of the Soviet Union. So on June 22nd, Hitler launched a devastating attack on their Soviet neighbor. The unexpected guest, 1941, as Stalin joins the democracies, Britain and America. The sound American strategy was dictated speedily aid to Moscow. Roosevelt made some military supplies available and extended $1 billion in Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, which was the first installment on an ultimate total of $11 billion. Russian valor and the Russian winter halted Hitler's invasion. At the Atlantic Conference in August of 1941, this was the meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt on a warship off the coast of Newfoundland. The history-making conference was held to discuss common problems, including the menace of Japan, and the Atlantic Charter was formed at that point, which was an 8-point charter. It was formally accepted by Churchill and Roosevelt, and later by the Soviet Union. It outlined aspirations for a better world at the war's end, argued for the rights of individuals rather than nations, and laid the groundwork for later advocacy on behalf of universal human rights. They opposed the imperialistic annexations, and no territorial changes, contrary to the wishes of the people, would happen, which means that they wanted self-determination. It also affirmed the right of the people to choose their own form of government, in particular to regain governments abolished by the dictators. The charter was declared for disarmament and a peace of security, pending a permanent system of general security, which would be the new League of Nations. The worldviews were that liberals took heart from the Atlantic Charter, as they had taken heart from Wilson's 14 points, especially gratifying to subject populations like the Poles, who were under the iron heel of a conqueror. Condemned in the United States by isolationists and others hostile to Roosevelt, people said, what right had neutral America to confer with belligerent British on common policies? And such critics missed the point. The United States was really no longer neutral. Lend-Lease shipments of arms to Britain were taking place during this time period, and freighters were needed to be escorted by U.S. warships. Britain did not have enough destroyers. Roosevelt made the fateful decision in July 1941. As Commander-in-Chief, he issued orders to the Navy to escort Lend-Lease shipments as far as Iceland. The British would then shepherd them the rest of the way. In September 1941, the U.S. destroyer Greer was attacked by a German sub that it had been trailing without damage to either, but Roosevelt proclaimed the shoot-on-sight policy. In October 17th, the escorting the destroyer Kearney It got engaged in a battle with the U-boats, and they lost 11 when it was crippled, but not sunk. 2 weeks later, the destroyer, the Reuben James, was torpedoed and sunk off the southwestern part of Iceland. Loss of more than 100 officers and enlisted men. So neutrality was still in the books, but not in the American hearts. Congress had voted in mid-November 1941 to pull the teeth from the now useless Neutrality Act of 1939 by allowing the arming of merchant ships, and Americans braced themselves for wholesale attacks by Hitler's submarines. Now we talk about the surprise assault on Pearl Harbor. And Japan, since September of 1940, had been a formal military ally of Nazi Germany, America's shooting foe in the North Atlantic, and Japan was mired down in costly and exhausting the incident with China. So Japan and American relations had been fatally dependent on immense shipments of steel, scrap iron, oil, and aviation gasoline from the United States. Such assistance to Japanese aggressors were highly unpopular in America. So Washington, late in 1940, imposed its first embargo on Japanese-bound supplies. The mid-1941, the United States froze Japan's assets in the United States and imposed the cessation of all shipments of gasoline and other sinews of war. As the oil gauge dropped, the squeeze on Japan grew steadily more nerve-wracking. Japan's leaders faced two alternatives: either knuckle under to America or break out of the embargo ring by a desperate attack on oil supplies and other riches of Southeast Asia. Tense negotiations took place when Japan came to Washington during November and early December of 1941. The State Department insisted that Japan leave China and offered Japan a new trade relation agreement on a limited basis. Japan's imperialists were unwilling to lose face by withdrawal. They were faced with capitulation or continued conquest, and they chose the sword. Washington had cracked the code and learned of Tokyo's decision for war. No one in high authority in Washington believed that the Japanese were either strong enough or foolhardy enough to strike at Hawaii. But they struck Pearl Harbor, while Tokyo deliberately prolonged the negotiations in Washington. On December 7, 1941, Black Sunday, the Japanese bombers attacked Pearl Harbor without warning. This was deemed by Roosevelt as a date which will live in infamy in his address to Congress. About 3,000 casualties were inflicted on American personnel. Many aircraft were destroyed. The battleship fleet was virtually wiped out when 8 were sunk. Numerous small vessels were damaged or destroyed, but fortunately for America, 3 aircraft carriers were currently not in the harbor. This shows the battleship West Virginia. This angered Congress the next day, and they officially recognized that war had been thrust on the United States. The Senate and the House roll call was 1 vote short of unanimity. Germany and Italy, the allies of Japan, spared Congress further debate by declaring war on December 11, 1941. The challenge was formally accepted by an unanimous vote of both the Senate and the House on the same day. Unofficial war, already of many months' duration, was now official. Japan's hara-kiri gamble in Hawaii had paid off only in the short run. To the very day of the attack, the strong majority of Americans wanted to keep out of the war, but the bombs on Pearl Harbor blasted the isolationists into silence. Pearl Harbor was not fully the answer to the question of why the United States went to war. The attack was the last explosion in a long chain reaction. Following the fall of France, Americans were confronted with the dilemma. They desired above all to stay out of the conflict, yet they did not want Britain to be knocked out. But they wished to halt Japanese conquests in the Far East. I think this is a repeat slide for some reason. Conquests were menaced not only American trade and security, but international peace as well. So to keep Britain from collapsing, yeah, this is a repeat slide. So we're going to forget that and move on to the last one. So to keep Japan from expanding, Washington undertook to cut off the vital Japanese supplies with embargoes that invited possible retaliation. Rather than let democracy die and dictatorship rule supreme, most citizens evidently were determined to support a policy that might lead to war, and it did.